invite you to return your attention to the room. Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. He was only 39 years old when he was murdered. If King were alive today, he would be celebrating his 87th birthday. His prophetic activism for peace and justice ended tragically early. Looking back, less than 5 years passed from King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963 to his assassination in 1968. And exactly 1 year to the day before he was killed, he preached a powerful and controversial sermon from the famous pulpit at Riverside Church in New York City. That sermon was titled "Beyond Vietnam, a Time to Break Silence." And in the next year, the year that turned out to be the final one of his short life, he was organizing a poor people's campaign. But neither that 1960 sermon against the war in Vietnam nor his 1968 campaign for an economic and social Bill of Rights came out of nowhere. In many ways, the radical King had been there for years. And radical doesn't just mean extreme. It also means getting to the root. And King had long understood that racism was a symptom of deeper systemic problems, and that racial injustice was inextricably linked with materialism, what could be called economic injustice, as well as militarism, the misuse of blood and treasure that should be used to support the common good, but instead is often used to support the military-industrial complex. He called racism, materialism, and militarism the three greatest triple threats to us ever fully succeeding in building the beloved community. Relatedly, the context for King's "I Have a Dream" speech is often referred to simply as the March on Washington. But the full name, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, is one of the many signs that King had long been concerned with what he called the inseparable twins of racial and economic injustice. And in that 1967 sermon at Riverside Church, King spoke directly about how the funds for President Johnson's war on poverty had been diverted to the war in Vietnam. In King's own words, he said, "I knew that America would never invest in the necessary funds or energies in the rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demoniacal, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such." We have seen similar patterns of misappropriated resources and war profiteering repeated in recent years. Considering how much could have been accomplished if the trillions, not the millions, not the billions, the trillions of dollars, not to mention the lives and the energy and the time spent in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, had instead been used on rebuilding infrastructure, improving education, and funding social programs at home. But despite this new boldness that we started to see in King at the end of his life, the radical King, again, had been there for years. Dr. King's courageous condemnation of the war in Vietnam emerged, among other influences, out of his training as a minister in the Black prophetic tradition. Many of you will recall parallels to another sermon from the Black prophetic tradition that hit the national stage and drew controversy during President Obama's first presidential campaign way back in 2008, right? After rehearsing a litany of American ethical failures, from the Japanese internment camps to a history of racism to all of the civilians who have been killed by U.S. weapons over the years, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, President Obama's former pastor at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, said that we should not always be singing "God bless America," but instead should sometimes be saying "God damn America" for killing innocent people and for treating human beings as less than humans, treating citizens of our own country as less than human. Needless to say, that clip, taken out of its historical context, did not play well on Fox News. And I bring up that incident because on Thursday, April 4th, 1968, the same day in which Dr. King was later assassinated, he called Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, where he continued to be the pastor, and to say that the title for his Sunday sermon would be, "Why America May Go to Hell." He was killed before he could preach that sermon, but as King had said in a speech less than 2 months earlier before his death, America too is going to hell if she doesn't use her wealth, if America does not use her vast resources of wealth to end poverty and make it possible for all God's children to have the basic necessities of life, she too will go to hell. In both cases, those words of dissent from King and later from Wright were spoken neither out of a true hatred for America nor a disrespect for the troops, but rather from a patriotic love that longs for America, including its military, to live up to its highest ideals and to once again be known around the world not for violence, but for revolution, for freedom, and for democracy. In the spirit of recognizing the radical King who sought to get to the root of the systemic problems of injustice, it is also vital to name that Dr. King's dream is about so much more than electing our nation's first black president, who of course also lives in a White House built by slaves. That's a topic for another sermon. King's dream of a beloved community is about organizing our society around recognizing what we call our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which means making sure every person has the basic necessities of life, and ultimately extends out to our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice, not for some, but for all. And at a time of increasing wealth equality, when the word socialism is being resurrected, it's significant to note that in 1966, when wealth inequality was much less extreme than it is today, Dr. King said, there must be, even at that time, a better distribution of wealth. And maybe America must move, King continued, toward a democratic socialism. Dr. King had first read Marx's Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto in 1949, almost 2 decades before his death. He read them, of course, he writes, over the Christmas holidays, because that's, of course, when you read Marx. So, traditionally, of course. In reflecting on those books, King wrote, Marx had revealed the danger of profit motive as the sole basis for an economic system. He said, capitalism is always in danger of inspiring men to be more concerned about making a living than making a life. He continued, we are prone to judge success by the index of our salaries or the size of our automobiles rather than by the quality of our service and of our relationship to humanity. He said, insofar as Marx posited a metaphysical materialism and ethical relativism and a strangulating totalitarianism, I have responded with an unambiguous no. But insofar as he pointed to the weaknesses in traditional capitalism alone, contributed to the growth of a definite self-consciousness in the masses, and challenged the social conscience of the Christian churches, I responded with a definite yes. That's similar to what we've talked about before of an organic Marxism for the 21st century, the need of what could be called for a new deal. And speaking of what it would look like to continue to turn King's dreams into deeds today, just this past March we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery marches. And when I think about the people carrying on King's legacy today, the first name that comes to mind to me today is the Reverend Dr. William Barber, leader of the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina against voting rights restrictions. Looking back 2 years earlier to 2013, when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Barber's activism that year helped catalyze years of grassroots organizing in North Carolina to ensure that that 50th anniversary date was not merely about remembering the past. Throughout the hot and wet summer of 2003 in North Carolina, tens of thousands of people, including many UUs, came for 13 consecutive Moral Mondays, and by the end of the legislative session, nearly 1,000 people had been arrested in the largest wave of mass civil disobedience since the lunch counter sit-ins of the 1960s. Barber is convinced that we are in the midst of what could potentially be a third Reconstruction in our nation's history. As some of you will recall from the election sermon I preached back in November, there was a paradigm shift in our constitutional framework that happened after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment of 1865 abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment of 1868 nationalized citizenship and made not the states but the federal government into the guarantor of American rights. And the 15th Amendment of 1870 gave all men the right to vote. Still all men at that point. But the total effect of those three amendments was a revolution of national purposes and of constitutional design, not simply a restoration of the Founders Movement, Founders Union in the wake of the Civil War. It was a paradigm shifting, what we call the Reconstruction. So those changes were all part of the first Reconstruction. President Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation may have freed our enslaved population, but a white supremacist response led to racist lynch mobs and the founding of the Ku Klux Klan 5 years later in 1868. To keep the now freed people of color so they may be freed, we're going to now keep them segregated. The white supremacist backlash to the first Reconstruction was codified into Jim Crow laws, culminating in the 1868 Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which says our Constitution supports separate but equal. And after a century of segregation following the first Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement led to what could be called a second Reconstruction of our nation and of our Constitution that started with the 1954's Brown versus the Board of Education, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and culminated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And just as there was a white supremacist backlash to the first Reconstruction through the KKK and through segregation, there was also a white supremacist reaction to the second Reconstruction of the Civil Rights Movement. And over the past 50 years, since the second Reconstruction, systemic racism has become less blatant, but much more insidious. And it will take nothing less than a third Reconstruction to dismantle what has been called the new Jim Crow. Mass incarceration in an age of colorblindness. So allegedly we're all colorblind, but the actual result of our laws and how they're enforced in a racist way has been mass incarceration. If you have not read the book, New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, I can't recommend it highly enough. I have at least one copy still in my office that I will give to you this morning if you ask for it and say you'll read it. For now, I'll give just a few highlights about the New Jim Crow that called for a third Reconstruction in order to live more fully into the promise of our American experiment. Consider, for example, that even though there are nearly identical uses of illegal drug use among whites and blacks, only a single percentage point separates the illegal drug use between whites and blacks. There's a much higher percentage of blacks prosecuted for drug use. In some states, black men have been admitted to prison on drug charges at rates nearly 20 to 50 times greater than those of white men. As a result of this racial bias, no other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial and ethnic minorities. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. In this light, calling for a third Reconstruction to make systemic changes is not hyperbolic. Today, I'll give you just one more statistic. Today, there are more African American adults under correctional control in prison or jail, on probation or on parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. There are more African American adults under correctional control today than were enslaved in 1850. Now, perversely, this biased use of our criminal justice system to insidiously enforce, and I think it's both conscious and unconscious, has gotten us there, to enforce a new Jim Crow, it ironically exploits a loophole in the 13th Amendment, which was part of the first Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment made slavery and involuntary servitude unconstitutional except as punishment for crimes whereof the party shall be duly convicted. As Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, details, once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service, those are all suddenly legal again in our country today in 2016. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of the old Jim Crow. We have not ended our racial caste system in America, we have merely redesigned it. This racist history is why it is important to build a movement not just around all lives matter, though of course all lives do matter, but around advocating in particular that black lives matter. And in seeking to carry on King's legacy in this age of needing a third Reconstruction, Reverend Barber calls in particular for a focus on protecting voting rights. It's no coincidence that voting rights, the centerpiece of the Second Reconstruction, are precisely what's being attacked today through Citizens United and other Supreme Court cases. Accordingly, I was heartened to hear President Obama pick up on this theme in his final State of the Union address this past week, trying to counteract the baseless fear-mongering around non-existent voter fraud, which is really just a cynical attempt to suppress voter turnout among racial minorities and among people who are poor. In the president's words, we've got to make it easier to vote, not harder. We need to modernize it for the way that we live now. This is America. We want to make it easier for people to participate. President Obama continued by name-checking Dr. King explicitly. He said, our brand of democracy is hard, but we are inspired by those visions of fairness, those voices of fairness and vision of grit and good humor and kindness, voices Dr. King believed would have the final word, voices of unarmed truth and unconditional love. As I move toward my conclusion, I'll mention just one other person, Chris Krass. He's a racial justice advocate, activist from our own Unitarian Universalist tradition, who's been especially inspiring to me recently in seeking to model a way of carrying on Dr. King's work today. For now, I'll share with you just one passage from Krass's book called Toward the Other America. Krass writes that to become an anti-racist religious community, the key question for white or white majority congregations is not how do we get people of color to join our church or congregation, what's sometimes called seeking the browning of the pews. He writes, it is, how can we make a prolonged, spiritually rooted, engaged commitment to uprooting white supremacy? If that leads to a more racially integrated congregation, that is incredible. But he said, that's missing the point of just saying we need more people of color here. It's about saying, how can we make an engaged commitment to uprooting white supremacy within this community and take ongoing collective action in our society. He continues, our goal is not just to have white people sit beside a person of color so as to make us feel like we aren't racist. Our goal is to build and be part of a beloved community united to ending structural oppression and to unleash collective liberation in our congregations, our schools, our neighborhoods, our workplaces, and throughout society. And he says, my goal isn't even to become just a great ally. He's like, my goal is to win. My goal is the abolition of the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy and the upbuilding of a multiracial democracy with economic, gender, and racial justice for all. Some of you may have received a chart. If you didn't, I'll hand one out. Did y'all get a one-page sheet along with the handout? Okay, so y'all did get that. Okay, if you didn't, let me know. So take a look at that right now if it's in front of you. That's my attempt in thinking through this, to think not just about this sermon this morning, but to think about how this connects with some of the other sermons I've preached recently of intersectionality and some of where we're going, along with this recent draft of a proposed mission statement. So if you start by reading it vertically, you'll see UUCF's proposed mission statement to encourage spiritual growth, to build a beloved community, and to act for peace and justice. And then you'll see MLK's triple threats, that the three things most holding us back from succeeding in building the beloved community are materialism, racism, and militarism. And then you'll see the Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde saying, what do we seek to dismantle? It's the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And then finally, the triple bottom line that we've taught a lot around our environmental justice, climate change activism. Profit is a real motive, but we need to balance it with the triple bottom line of people and planet. So start by reading it vertically, but don't just read it in that siloed way alone. Also, as you reflect on this, I invite you to start to read it horizontally, just seeing the ways that picking a spiritual path, and for you, whether that's Christianity or Buddhism or humanism, you're connecting to the larger human spirit, how that can be the greatest thing that helps us find meaning, not in the false benefit of material objects, but finding some sort of spiritual growth path for yourself to help balance out capitalism and not just profit alone, and the ways that committing to building a beloved community here amidst our diversity, that's the way that we start to combat racism of falsely stigmatizing people based on the melanin of their skin color, when we know that people are 99.9% the same on the genetic level. And that's the way we dismantle white supremacy, and that we care about people, not just profit. And finally, acting for peace and justice, this third part of our proposed new mission statement, is the way we combat against militarism and patriarchy, this rule through domination, and we start to say it's actually about this interdependent web of all existence. So I encourage you to think about, what does this maybe look like in your life and in the life of this congregation and in the life of your spheres of influence out in the world? That how might you begin to live some of this out and reflect on using some of this as a key to mitigate the problems in our world and work for collective liberation? It's not an easy path, but you're not in this alone. None of us are. We're in it together. So as we continue to reflect on these things, please rise and embody your spirit as we sing together hymn 1015, I Know I Can.